Whenever you're ready, we can begin.
Audio's good, you said? Okay. So every single year, one of the biggest things that we do as a company is we set budgets for all of our properties. And whether you have one property, a single family house, a duplex, a 4-unit, or you have over 5,000 properties, this is one of the most important things that you can do to help understand the financial performance of your businesses, because that's what real estate is. Each property is a business with operating income and operating expenses. So I'm going to tell you exactly what we do as a property management company to really set goals for all of our different business work streams that are predicated off of driving more profit or more NOI year over year over year for our owners. So the first thing that we have to do is we have to take time to assess last year's performance. So in 2024, we'll sit down as a director team and we'll go over how every single property performed. And we'll do this property by property, right? So we'll pull up the 100-unit apartment complex. We'll start with all of the operating expenses. So we'll look at things like property taxes. You know, there's not a lot you can do about property taxes, right? But it's just good to know, did those increase, did those decrease, why or why not? You know, where is that property? Because you want to have this information to be able to communicate with the owners. Same with insurance. Like, insurance is one of the fastest growing operating expense categories that you have. And understanding the types of insurance, do you need to vet this property out to see if a broker can get you better insurance, right? Just knowing how to put competitive insurance that not only protects you, but obviously you can get at a great price these days is not as easy as it once was. And then you want to look at things like management fees and general administrative. Like, we found a property, for example, that we were paying $200 for internet, right? For the staff that was there. That's really, really high, where all the rest of our properties we're getting for $50 to $60 a month. Sounds like a small expense, but if you have that across multiple properties every single month, that really adds up. And then you want to look at things like maintenance and repairs. Like, why was maintenance and repairs? And we do this by percentage, by the way. You know, if you look at the percentage that you're spending on M&R at a 10-unit property, and you got to look at only the percentage, not the dollars, because at a 10-unit property, then you can also compare that to a 100-unit property. There should be some sort of economy of scale, but if you see maintenance repair at 10% at one property and 6% at the other property, you might ask, what's going on? Why are we spending more money? Is there a root cause that we're not solving of why we have so much plumbing at this specific property? Is there anything that we can do CapEx wise to eliminate that root cause and drop our overall operating expenses? Or should we just notate that at property one, it is still not stable? It's still within the first 12 months and we're rehabbing units, right? And we're still optimizing the property. Whereas property number two, we've owned for 3 years, it's stabilized, it's functioning well, so we should expect it to have a lower maintenance and repair of 6% versus 10. Those are all things you just want to be able to understand. And then we also take a look at we call it community operating expenses. These are things like, how much are we paying for lawn and landscaping? How much are we paying for trash? We really work hard to renegotiate our trash bills. A lot of people just accept what they're getting, but when we acquire a property, we look into, can we break that contract? Can we bid it out to 3 different companies instead of just taking, for example, waste management? And then snow vendors, you know, common area cleaning, anything really from a community aspect that we can look into do it better, but also more efficiently. So as you go through and you look at how did everything perform on the expense side, you then take even more time and you look at the operating income. You want to take a look at things like, were we able to increase rent competitive to the market? Like, at what percent did you increase the overall rent? Was it 2%? Was it 5%? Was it 7%? You know, what does that look like? And again, just like expenses, there might be some properties that have rent growth of 8%, while other properties have 3%. You got to understand, like, is one unstable and we just have a lot of brand new rehab units renting at market, which is really pushing up the gross operating income. And maybe you have a more stabilized property where people are just not moving out. So you're a little bit less aggressive on rent increases. Understanding the story behind the property and just having that conversation is very important. Then we move on to vacancy and delinquency, right? How is this property performing compared to the rest? You know, for us, we want delinquency always to be under 1%. We met that goal. We're at a 0.7% last year. And then we want vacancy to be around 3%. And now people argue about this, like, why do you want it at 3%? Well, we feel like if vacancy is closer to 1%, then we aren't as aggressive as what the market is telling us we should be with rent increases, because some turnover is good. And if we feel like we're maybe at 6% vacancy, then maybe we were too aggressive, especially if this was a stabilized property and we need to pull back a little bit on the rent increases. You kind of let supply and demand tell you where you should be, and by assessing last year's performance and vacancy, you can kind of remake the market rent for the next year. So for example, if you had a property that consistently stayed at 1% in 2024, we're going to look at market rents, and we're probably going to increase market rents a little bit more aggressive than, say, a property that had vacancy of 3 or 4%. And that'll kind of be our renewal strategy for 2025. So again, just by reviewing last year's performance in some of these key categories, it actually sets the stage for what you want to do in 2025. We also look at other income. That's a very big category. It could be anywhere between 5 to 15%. Taking a look at things like, can we rent out internet here, right? Can we rent out garages? Is there storage opportunities? Are we maximizing pet fees? Like, what are the other income categories that we can make sure that we're appropriately charging for and adding value for? And that, again, is something you can compare property by property, and it really sets up your projected amount for 2025. So, in general for us, step one is very comprehensive, and it's just understanding how last year's performance is now going to dictate this year's performance. Before we get into 2025, we're going to do two more things. We're going to assess the CapEx plan. Any good property management company or real estate investor takes the time to look into what are we doing at the property to move it forward, especially if you acquired that property and it's still part of the repositioning plan, meaning that you acquired the business that operated like A, and then you created a plan of rehab, system optimization, rent increases, whatever, to change it to business B, which usually business B equals a lot higher NOI. So you got to assess, where am I on that journey? What other CapEx is needed? Even for stabilized properties, right? Like, if you are a real estate investor, you're like, man, I didn't realize that I needed to do a roof this year. That really screwed up my whole 2025. You're a bad investor. You're not organized. So when we assess every single property, we have a list of the major capital improvement plan and what that property needs. That could be going through things like parking lot or mechanicals that are due, roofs. Because for us, at over 5,000 units, we want to try to time some of this stuff out. It makes sense to be able to hire and negotiate a really good contract with a roofer, for example, to do 40 roofs in 1 year, then to spread out those 40 roofs across maybe 5 years. Or we want to be able to tell that roofer that we have 40 more roofs coming in 2026, so if they can give us a discount, or we can lock in some sort of pricing this year, it allows us to be able to lock in pricing possibly into the future. So by taking a look at CapEx, it kind of helps you assess what else needs to be done at this property. And I don't think you should be making 2025 goals and commitments and budgets without understanding what is going to be injected into your property that could potentially substantially increase operating income, but it could also decrease operating expenses. Like, if you plan on doing 50 rehabs in the next year, and that's part of your CapEx plan, you should expect maintenance and repairs most likely to drop shortly after that. You're not going to have appliance repairs when every appliance is brand new. So really taking the time to understand where you are for CapEx on both unstable properties but also stabilization properties helps you make a budget, but also helps you project 2025. Last thing, we also look at each property and ask ourselves, did we figure anything out? Did we automate? Did we input a different system? Did we utilize technology? Is there an employee or employees that have owned that property for a longer period of time that have unlocked efficiency? A lot of times for us, when we acquire a business, we know 90% of what we're going to do with our operating procedures, but not the last 10%. The last 10% we find over time, right? We find by operating the property. We find different things about the property that maybe we didn't fully understand before, and now we do, and that should unlock some sort of efficiency for the property. We're always looking for that. So obviously, once we unlock that efficiency, we make note of it. And at the beginning of the year, we're looking at, okay, clearly we're doing this much differently or much better. Could be something as simple as just having the best marketing pictures. Like a lot of times we'll acquire a property in the middle of winter, showcasing pictures with snow on the exterior doesn't really capitalize on our beautiful Wisconsin summers. So we're trying to rent these units without looking at the landscaping and the bright green grass and everything else that we do on the outside to really showcase the location and amenities, etc. So that might be just something that just helps ramp up the overall operating income. So I know that's a lot. We put a lot of time into it. And once we fully understand how the year was, we will just end with wins and opportunities. So we'll put together, hey, here were the 3 things that we did really well for this property. Here are the 3 things that we think we can definitely improve on. And we make sure we can give that to that specific owner. It's really important for us to be able to showcase, we're very aware of how this property is running. We're the operators of this property. And we want to know this property better than anybody. And that sets the stage for 2025 projections. So now this is where myself and the president of the property management company is going to go through, and with that information at hand, we're going to allocate a certain percentage increase in all the major categories. So we're going to take, hey, this is where rents were, this is where vacancy was, this is where other income was, and we're going to increase the overall operating income by a certain percentage by all the categories. And then we're going to do the same thing for expenses. We're obviously going to increase property taxes by a certain percentage, usually about 5% in our markets. Then we're going to increase insurance, right? We're going to increase utilities, the categories that we know are most likely going to go up. And then we're going to look at other categories like, did we find ways to be able to save on maintenance and repairs? Did we find ways to be able to save in trash, snow, landscaping, grass, etc.? Yes, no, because we do know costs are going up. So we're going to allocate that way. But if we're able to unlock efficiencies, maybe not. So we basically go through and we put an allocation of what every single category should be. And then obviously down to the bottom, there's an NOI section, a profit section. And every single property, our goal is to increase that NOI by the highest percentage possible, right? It's not just as easy as raising rents. Because the increased NOI, the customers, the residents have to love living there. And I promise you, if they live there versus moving, you will be much more profitable. So it's a balance between charging an appropriate amount or a fair amount and giving value to your customers so that they stay, while also charging enough to be able to increase the overall profitability of your property. And you got to increase it more than the expenses are increasing. So it's a tough balance. So once we go through and we do all that, we'll also allocate, then we'll sit down with our directors. If you don't have directors, you should just be asking yourself this. You want one other person with an outside perspective to be able to approve now all the budgets. So we'll go through things like, hey, director of sales, right? Do you agree with the vacancy projection for this property? Do you agree with the rent increases for this property? Do you agree with the other income increases for this property? And if they say no, all they have to do is bring a business case, right? So maybe we screwed something up. Maybe they did more research on the market. Maybe they want to be more aggressive, right? Because the more aggressive they are, they have their own goals within their work centers that they can unlock and be able to make more money. And then we'll do the same thing with expenses, right? I'll go to my operations director and he'll take a look at the allocation of, let's just say 6% for maintenance and repairs. And he's going to either agree with that or disagree with that. But what's important about this strategy is at the end of the day, there's only one person that owns each category. There's no shared accountability anywhere in my company. And in this case, my operations director, who then approved that 6% budget, now he owns it, okay? There's no going back. You had your chance to submit your business. We make sure that everybody is behind the commitments of these numbers. And ultimately, those numbers will lead to our net operating income increases across the portfolio, okay? And we've been doing this now, for the last 5 years with a lot of success. In fact, I would tell you 2024 was a milestone year for us operationally. We significantly increased the overall NOI of every single property in the portfolio other than 3. which is, unheard of, especially since we're managing over 150 different properties and over 5,000 different units. So for us to be able to do that, there has to be really, really strong accountability on each one of these categories, but there also has to be such strong awareness, right, of how the previous year performed so that you make commitments that you can achieve. And for us, once we've locked in that 2025 projections, it's kind of like 2025 goals, right? A lot of people make goals to be healthier, to lose weight, but those goals or those commitments fall apart within the first 30 days. So if you are doing these budgets, one of the last things I would encourage you to do is you need to assess on a monthly basis, where are my properties? Are they where we said they were going to be? So we do that monthly, right? We go through, we actually divide it up by regions because it's too tough to go through every property every month. And we just make sure that, the regions or the collection of properties are on the right track or not on the right track. If they're not on the right track, right, that's where we dig more granular and we'll look at specific properties and say, hey, why not? What do we need to do differently? And I realize that a lot of you guys that are listening to this might not own their own property management company or have a property management company or maybe operate their own properties. That's okay, because I didn't either. From when I owned 7 units to 252 units, okay, I had a third-party management company. And what we would do is this same activity. I would go through all of my properties, I'd look at how they perform myself, because you as an investor, right, not the property manager, you as an investor should know your properties, be aware of your properties and how they're performing. And I would make my own projections. And then I'd sit down with the property manager and we'd go through all the categories and I'd ask him to commit to them, just like my directors do today. So I'd sit down with the person in charge of my portfolio at the property management company and I'd say, hey, I think my overall portfolio should be at 5% for vacancy this year, and this is why. Based on where we came in last year, this is slightly more aggressive, but I feel like I haven't added a lot of properties to the portfolio. They're getting more stable. This is where I think is fair for you guys to be able to achieve. And he's gonna say, I'm just gonna ask him to either agree or not agree, and why. And if he agrees to that 5% number, then we're locked in, right? And then we're gonna talk about rent increases. What do you think is a fair percentage to put on rent increases for my properties? We'll go property by property, and we will agree to those in the beginning of the year. And what's really cool about this is, just like we do as a company where we assess if we're on track on a monthly basis, you as the investor can then ask your property manager for what? You can ask them for some sort of reporting or some sort of acknowledgement when they are off track. Who cares if you're maybe off track on one property, when it comes to maintenance and repairs. But if your entire portfolio is at a 12% for maintenance and repairs, and at the beginning of the year, you guys agreed that you would be at 8, right? That's a 4% difference. That's a significant amount of difference in maintenance and repairs. You should be sitting down with the property manager to ask, where's the 4% coming from? Why are we off track after January? And the property manager should have the opportunity to be able to dig in, let you know what happened, and more importantly, how they're gonna correct that in February. I think that's where a lot of investors get it wrong, right? You don't have to have a property management company yourself. You just have to have, you as an investor, have to be really competent in how your business should run. These aren't properties, these are businesses. And a business has operating expenses that you should be in charge of, that you should know, that should have a certain percentage of your overall income that is allocated to each one of those items, including, by the way, obviously CapEx. A lot of investors don't put aside reserves. That's crazy. If you're not putting a certain amount of your profit towards future CapEx and you're in real estate, then then you're going to be surprised by the roof that you have to do. That makes no sense. That makes no sense. When I sat down with my property management company, I would ask them every year, okay, what kind of things do I got to do CapEx wise? Shit, those 2 roofs, right? They're not going to sneak up on me. I know I got to do 2 roofs. Then I would just ask, do I got to do them both this year? Like, have you had any leaks? Like, do you think it's going to cause further damage? And maybe you'd be like, this one definitely we've heard is not doing very well, so let's do it, right? In the back of my mind, I know I got to do that next one probably the year after. Sit down, put together a percentage of expenses, look at your income, be organized, guys. Be organized. This is almost like you're setting a specific goal or commitment with every key category. So I hope this was helpful. This is exactly step by step what I've done over the course of the last 5 years within my property management company. But more importantly, I've been doing this for over a decade. Like for 12 years, when I had one property, you know, I sat down on one single family property. I sat down, and you do it too. Hopefully, when you underwrite a property before you buy it, you're like, hey, here's what I think the income should be. Here's what the expenses should be, right? So you're just doing that every year. So I think like the thing I would encourage you guys to do every single year is you are basically looking at your property as, what would get me excited to buy this property in 2025? You're just re-underwriting your property, setting goals, checking on past performance, and that should set up future performance.
Trying to do a little conclusion.
Um,
Little smile.
Yeah, I'll do a little
Okay.
conclusion.
Okay. Go ahead.
Thanks for listening today. If you guys have any questions about any of the key details, I know I went through a ton, and I went through it kind of fast. If you haven't tell them, pretty passionate about this part of the business because I think it's a huge unlock. Drop them in the comments and I'll try to answer as much as I can.
Okay. I'm going to have you do the conclusion, Logan.